The morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site as Marcus Thompson stepped out of his pickup truck. At 7 feet 2 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, he had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the truck's doorframe. The other workers on the site had already begun their day, but conversation seemed to pause whenever Marcus walked by. It wasn't fear that made them stop and stare. It was pure amazement at his incredible size. Marcus had grown used to the reactions. Throughout his 32 years of life, he had been the tallest person in every room he entered. His massive hands could palm a basketball like others held a tennis ball, and his shoulders were so broad that he often had trouble fitting through standard doorways. But despite his intimidating appearance, those who knew Marcus well understood that he possessed the gentlest heart imaginable. Growing up in rural Tennessee, Marcus had always been different. By age 12, he was already 6 feet tall and still growing. His parents, both of average height, were initially concerned about their son's unusual growth pattern. Medical tests revealed that Marcus had a rare genetic condition that caused excessive growth hormone production. While this explained his extraordinary size, it also meant he would face unique challenges throughout his life. The schoolyard was where Marcus first learned that being different could be both a blessing and a burden. Other children were sometimes afraid of him, whispering behind his back about the giant boy in their class. But Marcus never used his size to intimidate or hurt anyone. Instead, he became the protector of smaller kids who were being bullied. His mere presence was often enough to stop troublemakers in their tracks. His childhood was filled with practical difficulties that most people never had to consider. Finding clothes that fit required special orders, and his family had to reinforce their furniture to support his weight. School desks were too small, doorways too low, and cars too cramped. But Marcus's mother, Sarah, always reminded him that God had made him special for a reason. Sarah Thompson was a nurse at the local hospital, and she often brought Marcus along during her volunteer work at the children's ward. It was there that Marcus discovered his true calling. The children, initially startled by his enormous size, quickly warmed up to his gentle nature and kind smile. He would sit on the floor to make himself less intimidating, letting the young patients climb on his arms like he was a human jungle gym. One particular afternoon changed everything for Marcus. A 5-year-old girl named Emma, who was recovering from a serious surgery, had been crying for hours and refusing to eat. The nurses were at a loss for what to do. When Marcus entered her room, Emma's tears stopped immediately. She stared up at him with wide eyes and whispered, "Are you a friendly giant like in my storybook?" Marcus knelt down beside her bed, his massive frame folding carefully to bring himself to her eye level. "I am indeed," he said in his surprisingly soft voice. "And friendly giants always make sure little princesses eat their vegetables so they can grow strong and healthy." Emma giggled and began eating her lunch, asking Marcus to tell her stories about being so tall. From that day forward, Marcus began volunteering at the children's hospital every weekend. He discovered that his unusual appearance, which had often made him feel like an outsider, could actually be a source of wonder and joy for sick children. They saw him not as someone to fear, but as a real-life fairy tale character who had stepped out of their imagination. His reputation as the gentle giant began to spread throughout the community. Parents would bring their children to meet Marcus, and he never turned anyone away. He learned magic tricks with his large hands, told elaborate stories about adventures in giant land, and always had time to listen to whatever was troubling the children he met. At his construction job, Marcus's colleagues initially kept their distance. His supervisor, Joe Martinez, later admitted that he had been nervous about hiring someone so large, worried that Marcus might be aggressive or difficult to work with. But it didn't take long for everyone to realize that Marcus was not only incredibly gentle, but also one of the hardest workers they had ever seen. His extraordinary strength made him invaluable on the job site. Tasks that required multiple workers could often be handled by Marcus alone. He could lift steel beams that would normally require machinery, and his height allowed him to reach places that would otherwise need scaffolding. But what impressed his co-workers most was his patience and willingness to help others. New workers were often intimidated when they first met Marcus, but he had developed a routine for putting people at ease. He would introduce himself with a warm handshake, being careful not to squeeze too hard with his powerful grip. He spoke softly and made self-deprecating jokes about his size, immediately showing that he was aware of how others might perceive him and that he held no ill will toward anyone's initial reactions. During lunch breaks, Marcus would often share stories about the children he visited at the hospital. His rough, calloused hands would gesture gently as he described teaching a young boy how to tie his shoes or reading bedtime stories to a girl who couldn't sleep. His co-workers began to understand that beneath Marcus's imposing exterior was someone who cared deeply about making others feel better. One winter day, a new worker named Danny Rodriguez joined the crew. Danny was small in stature and had a noticeable limp from a childhood accident. Some of the other workers made occasional jokes about Danny's size and his slower pace, but Marcus immediately took the young man under his wing. He showed Danny the ropes without making him feel incapable, and his protective presence ensured that any teasing stopped immediately. The relationship between Marcus and Danny became legendary on the job site. They were an unlikely pair, the gentle giant and the determined little man. But they worked together like a perfectly matched team. Danny's attention to detail complemented Marcus's strength, and Marcus's calm demeanor helped Danny gain confidence in his abilities. As word spread about Marcus's volunteer work and his reputation as someone who genuinely cared about others, people from all walks of life began seeking him out. Teachers asked him to visit their classrooms. Community centers requested his presence at events, and families invited him to birthday parties and special occasions. Marcus never charged money for these appearances, considering them part of his mission to spread joy and comfort wherever he could. He understood that his unique physical gifts came with a responsibility to use them in service of others, especially those who needed healing, encouragement, or simply a reason to smile. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was unusually quiet when Dr. Rebecca Chen received the call that would change everything. A massive accident on the interstate had resulted in multiple casualties, and they needed all available hands. As she prepared for the incoming ambulances, she had no idea that one phone call would bring Marcus Thompson into her life in an extraordinary way. Marcus was having dinner at his small apartment when his phone rang. Sarah, his mother, was calling from the hospital where she worked as head nurse in the pediatric intensive care unit. Her voice was strained with worry as she explained the situation. A school bus carrying 30 children from a local elementary school had been involved in a serious collision with a truck. Multiple children were severely injured, and the hospital was overwhelmed. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed to the hospital. He had been volunteering there for over 5 years, but this was different. These weren't children who were already patients. These were scared, hurt kids who had been pulled from a terrifying accident. Many were crying for their parents who were frantically trying to get to the hospital from various locations around the city. When Marcus arrived at St. Mary's, the scene was controlled chaos. Medical staff rushed between treatment rooms, parents sobbed in the waiting area, and the sound of crying children echoed through the corridors. Dr. Chen was coordinating the emergency response when she noticed the enormous man walking through the entrance. Hospital security moved to intercept him, assuming he might be a threat, but Sarah Thompson quickly intervened. "That's my son, Marcus," she explained to Dr. Chen. "He volunteers with our pediatric patients. The children love him, and right now we need all the help we can get to keep these kids calm while you work on them." Dr. Chen was skeptical. She had been working with injured children for 15 years and understood how traumatic experiences could make them even more fearful of strangers, especially someone as physically imposing as Marcus. But the situation was desperate, and traditional methods weren't working. Several children were becoming increasingly hysterical, which was making their medical treatment more difficult. Marcus approached the first treatment room where 8-year-old Tyler Williams was receiving stitches for a deep cut on his forehead. The boy was screaming and fighting against the nurses who were trying to hold him still. His parents hadn't arrived yet, and he was terrified and alone. Dr. Chen watched from the doorway as Marcus slowly entered the room. "Hey there, brave warrior," Marcus said softly, his deep voice somehow managing to cut through Tyler's screams. The boy looked up, his crying temporarily stopped by amazement at seeing someone so incredibly tall. "I heard you were in a battle with a dragon today. Is that where you got this battle scar?" Tyler's eyes widened with curiosity despite his pain and fear. "There wasn't any dragon," he whispered. "It was a big truck." Marcus nodded seriously as he knelt down beside the treatment table, bringing his face closer to Tyler's level. Ah, you're right. Sometimes trucks can be even scarier than dragons, but you know what? I have a special power that helps heal battle wounds. Would you like me to use it on you? The medical staff watched in amazement as Marcus began to weave an elaborate fantasy around Tyler's treatment. He convinced the boy that the antiseptic was magic healing potion, and that the stitches were special warrior thread that would make him incredibly strong. Tyler not only stopped fighting but actually began helping the doctors by holding still and following their instructions. Dr. Chen realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus had managed to transform a traumatic medical experience into an adventure story that captivated the child's imagination. She quickly asked him to move to the next room, where 9-year-old Isabella Martinez was refusing to let anyone examine her injured arm. Isabella had been sitting alone, turned away from everyone and sobbing quietly. She spoke only Spanish, and none of the available medical staff were fluent enough to effectively communicate with her. Her parents were stuck in traffic, still an hour away from the hospital. Marcus approached her differently this time. To everyone's surprise, Marcus began speaking in fluent Spanish. His pronunciation was clear and gentle as he introduced himself and asked Isabella about her favorite things. She tentatively responded, telling him about her pet cat and her love of drawing. Marcus asked her to draw a picture of her cat on a piece of paper while the doctors examined her arm, promising to show the picture to all the other children in the hospital. Isabella became so engrossed in her drawing and her conversation with Marcus that she barely noticed when the doctors set her broken arm and applied the cast. By the time they were finished, she was smiling and asking Marcus if he would help her draw more pictures. Word spread quickly through the hospital about the gentle giant who could calm frightened children with seemingly magical abilities. Dr. Chen found herself calling Marcus into room after room, watching him adapt his approach to each child's specific needs and fears. With teenage patients, he spoke about sports and music. With younger children, he created fantasy stories and games. With non-English speakers, he somehow managed to communicate in their languages or found creative ways to transcend language barriers entirely. But it was in the room with 6-year-old Amy Foster that Marcus truly showed the depth of his compassionate heart. Amy had suffered the most serious injuries in the accident and was scheduled for emergency surgery. She was conscious, but weak, and her parents had been told there were significant risks involved in the operation. The little girl was terrified and kept asking if she was going to die. Marcus spent 3 hours sitting beside Amy's bed, holding her tiny hand in his enormous one. He told her story after story about a magical kingdom where all the doctors were really fairy godmothers, and the operating room was actually a place where they gave people special powers. He promised Amy that he would be waiting for her when she woke up from her magical sleep, and that he would bring her a special gift from the giant kingdom. As Amy was wheeled into surgery, she looked back at Marcus and said, "Promise you'll be here when I wake up?" Marcus nodded solemnly and gave her his word. Dr. Chen, who was performing the surgery, later said that Amy's calm demeanor before the operation was unprecedented for such a young patient facing major surgery. The operation was successful, but Amy would need to remain in intensive care for several days. Marcus kept his promise, sleeping in the hospital waiting room and being at Amy's bedside whenever she was conscious. He brought her a stuffed giant that he had specially made by a local seamstress, complete with a friendly smile and arms big enough to give the best hugs. During Amy's recovery, Marcus continued working with all the other children from the bus accident. He created a support network among them, encouraging the less injured kids to visit and help cheer up those who were still bedridden. He organized art projects, storytelling sessions, and even a mini talent show performed entirely from hospital beds and wheelchairs. The parents of these children were initially as surprised as the medical staff had been. Many admitted later that they had never expected someone so large and intimidating looking to be so incredibly gentle and intuitive with their kids. Marcus won over not just the children but their entire families, becoming a source of strength and comfort during one of the most difficult times in their lives. Dr. Chen began documenting Marcus's interactions with her patients, fascinated by his natural ability to provide therapeutic comfort without any formal training. She had studied child psychology and knew that what Marcus was doing instinctively was more effective than many trained professionals could achieve. His size, rather than being intimidating, had become part of his healing power. Children saw him as a protective figure, someone strong enough to keep them safe from anything that might hurt them. 6 months after the bus accident, Marcus Thompson's life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The local newspaper had written a feature story about the gentle giant of St. Mary's Hospital, and suddenly everyone in the city knew his name. But fame was never something Marcus had sought, and the attention made him uncomfortable at times. Dr. Rebecca Chen had been working behind the scenes to create something unprecedented. She had spent months researching and writing proposals, meeting with hospital administrators and consulting with child psychology experts from across the country. Her goal was ambitious: to create the first official therapeutic companion program at St. Mary's Hospital, with Marcus as the founding practitioner. The program would be revolutionary in the medical field. Rather than relying solely on traditional therapy methods, it would incorporate Marcus's natural ability to connect with patients through storytelling, imagination, and emotional support. Dr. Chen believed that Marcus's unique combination of physical presence and gentle spirit could be scientifically studied and potentially replicated to help hospitals everywhere. However, not everyone was convinced that this was a good idea. Dr. Harrison Webb, the hospital's chief administrator, had serious concerns about liability and professional standards. During a tense board meeting, he questioned whether someone without formal medical training should be given such significant responsibilities with vulnerable patients. "I understand that Mr. Thompson has been helpful," Dr. Webb argued, "but what happens when a child has a serious medical emergency while he's providing this therapeutic companionship? What if his methods actually interfere with proper medical care? We could be opening ourselves up to lawsuits and professional scrutiny." Dr. Chen had anticipated these concerns and came prepared with extensive documentation. She presented video recordings of Marcus's interactions with patients, showing measurable improvements in their cooperation during procedures, reduced anxiety levels, and faster recovery times. She had consulted with pediatric psychologists, who confirmed that Marcus's instinctive methods aligned with established therapeutic principles, but the most compelling evidence came from the families themselves. Parents had written dozens of letters to the hospital administration, describing how Marcus had not only helped their children heal physically, but had also helped them process their trauma in healthy ways. Many children who had been expected to develop long-term phobias or anxiety disorders were instead showing remarkable resilience. The breakthrough came when Amy Foster's parents, Linda and Robert, attended the board meeting to advocate for Marcus personally. Amy had made a complete recovery from her injuries, but more importantly, she had developed such a positive association with the hospital that she actually looked forward to her follow-up appointments. This was almost unheard of for a child who had experienced such significant trauma. Before Marcus, Linda Foster explained to the board, Amy was having nightmares every night and was terrified of anyone in medical scrubs. She would scream whenever we drove past the hospital. Now she talks about becoming a doctor herself someday, so she can help other children the way Marcus helped her. He didn't just heal her body, he healed her spirit. The board voted to approve a 6-month trial program, with strict guidelines and constant supervision. Marcus would work under Dr. Chen's direct oversight, receive formal training in child development and medical ethics, and be required to document all his patient interactions. If the program showed measurable positive outcomes, it could potentially become permanent. Marcus was both excited and nervous about the new responsibility. He had never thought of his natural empathy as something that could be studied or formalized. The idea of taking classes and following protocols felt strange after years of simply following his instincts. But he understood that this opportunity could help him reach even more children who needed comfort and healing. The training process was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Dr. Chen arranged for him to work with child psychologists, pediatric nurses, and even art therapists. He learned about developmental stages, trauma responses, and communication techniques. Most importantly, he learned how to recognize when a situation was beyond his abilities and required immediate professional intervention. One of his instructors was Dr. Patricia Williams, a renowned child psychologist from Chicago who specialized in trauma recovery. She was initially skeptical about the entire program, believing that formal training might actually diminish Marcus's natural abilities. However, after observing him work with several patients, she became one of his strongest advocates. Marcus has an intuitive understanding of childhood psychology that would take most people years of study to develop, Dr. Williams reported to the hospital board. What we're doing in this training isn't teaching him new skills, we're helping him understand why his natural methods work so well and how to apply them more effectively. The first major test of the new program came when the hospital admitted 7-year-old Michael Chen, who had been severely burned in a house fire. Michael had not spoken a single word since the accident 3 weeks earlier. His parents were desperate, having tried multiple therapists and specialists with no success. The boy seemed to be trapped in his own world of fear and pain. Dr. Chen assigned Marcus to work with Michael, knowing that this case would be closely watched by the hospital administration and could determine the future of the entire program. Marcus spent the first hour simply sitting quietly in Michael's room, not trying to force any interaction. He understood that traumatized children sometimes needed to feel safe before they could begin to trust again. On the second day, Marcus brought a small wooden figure that he had carved himself, a tiny firefighter no bigger than Michael's thumb. He placed it on the bedside table without saying anything, then sat in his usual chair. Michael's eyes followed the figure, and Marcus could see the first flicker of curiosity the boy had shown since his arrival. Over the following days, Marcus gradually introduced more carved figures. Police officers, doctors, nurses, and regular people who helped others. He would move them around on the bedside table like characters in a silent play, never speaking directly to Michael but telling stories to the figures themselves. The firefighter would tell the doctor about rescuing people from dangerous situations. The police officer would describe keeping neighborhoods safe. On the 5th day, something remarkable happened. Michael reached out and touched the firefighter figure, moving it slightly closer to himself. Marcus pretended not to notice, continuing his quiet storytelling. But he felt a surge of hope. Michael was beginning to engage with the world again. The breakthrough came during the 2nd week when Michael whispered his first words since the accident. "The firefighter is brave." Marcus nodded seriously and replied, "Yes, he is. Just like another brave person I know." Michael looked up at Marcus for the first time, making eye contact that lasted several seconds before looking away again. From that moment, Michael's recovery accelerated dramatically. He began speaking more each day, first to the carved figures, then to Marcus, and finally to his parents and the medical staff. He started participating in his physical therapy sessions and even began eating regular meals again. The transformation was so remarkable that child psychologists from other hospitals began requesting to observe Marcus's methods. But success brought new challenges. The media attention increased significantly when medical journals began publishing articles about the therapeutic companion program. Marcus found himself being invited to conferences and medical schools to speak about his work. While he appreciated the recognition, the spotlight made him increasingly uncomfortable. The real difficulty began when other hospitals started trying to replicate the program without understanding its deeper principles. Some institutions hired large men to work with pediatric patients, assuming that physical size was the key factor in Marcus's success. These efforts often failed because they missed the crucial element of genuine compassion and emotional intelligence that made Marcus so effective. Dr. Chen realized that they needed to be more careful about how they shared their research and methods. Marcus's success wasn't something that could be easily copied or mass-produced. It came from a unique combination of his personal experiences, natural empathy, and genuine desire to help others heal. The challenge was figuring out how to preserve the authenticity of his approach, while still helping other medical professionals learn from his example. The call came at 3 a.m, jarring Marcus from a deep sleep. Dr. Chen's voice was urgent but controlled as she explained the situation. A family of 4 had been in a devastating car accident on the highway just outside town. The parents were in critical condition, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Jake, were being airlifted to St. Mary's Hospital with serious injuries. Marcus was dressed and driving to the hospital within minutes. During the 18 months since the therapeutic companion program had begun, he had learned to recognize when his presence would be absolutely crucial. Something in Dr. Chen's voice told him this was going to be one of the most challenging cases he had ever faced. When he arrived, the emergency department was in controlled chaos. Sophie had suffered a traumatic brain injury and was unconscious, while Jake had multiple broken bones and was in shock. But the most devastating news was yet to come. Both parents had died at the scene of the accident. The children were now orphans, and they didn't know it yet. Dr. Chen pulled Marcus aside to brief him on the situation. Sophie might not wake up for days, if at all. Jake is conscious but hasn't spoken since he arrived. We haven't told him about his parents yet. We wanted you here first. These children are going to need more support than we've ever provided before. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like never before. He had helped children through medical procedures, trauma recovery, and fear, but he had never been asked to help someone face the loss of their entire world. As he walked toward Jake's room, he found himself praying for wisdom and strength. Jake was lying in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling with wide, empty eyes. His left leg was in a cast, his right arm in a sling, and there were bandages covering several cuts on his face. But it was the look in his eyes that broke Marcus's heart. The child looked completely lost and alone. Marcus approached slowly, as he always did with traumatized children. He pulled up a chair and sat down without saying anything, simply making his presence known. Jake's eyes moved to look at this enormous man who had entered his room, but his expression didn't change. After several minutes of comfortable silence, Marcus spoke softly. "My name is Marcus. I'm here to sit with you for a while, if that's okay." Jake didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. Marcus continued, "I heard you were in a big scary accident. Sometimes after scary things happen, we feel all mixed up inside. That's normal, and it's okay." Hours passed as Marcus maintained his quiet vigil. Nurses came and went, checking Jake's vital signs and adjusting his medications. But Marcus remained constant. He didn't try to force conversation or interaction. He simply stayed present, offering the comfort of his steady, protective presence. It was during the afternoon shift change that Jake finally spoke. "Where's my mommy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Marcus felt his heart break as he realized the moment had arrived that he had been dreading all day. Marcus had been trained for this situation, but no amount of preparation could make it easier. He moved his chair closer to Jake's bed and spoke with infinite gentleness. "Jake, I need to tell you something very important, and it's going to be very sad news. Your mommy and daddy were hurt very badly in the accident. The doctors tried everything they could to help them, but they couldn't make them better. Your parents died, Jake. They're not coming back." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at Marcus with uncomprehending eyes, as if the words were too big and too impossible to process. Then slowly, tears began to flow down his small face. Marcus reached out and gently took Jake's uninjured hand in his own massive one. "I know this is the worst thing that could ever happen," Marcus said softly, "and I know you probably feel scared and angry and confused all at the same time. That's okay. All of those feelings are okay. And I want you to know that even though your mommy and daddy can't be here with you anymore, you're not alone. There are people who care about you and will take care of you." Jake's tears turned into sobs, and Marcus carefully gathered the small boy into his arms, being mindful of his injuries. Jake clung to Marcus as if he were drowning, and Marcus was his lifeline. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Jake wasn't alone with his fear and pain. Over the following days, Marcus rarely left the children's wing of the hospital. Sophie remained unconscious, and the doctors weren't sure when or if she would wake up. Marcus would sit beside her bed, talking to her as if she could hear him, telling her about her little brother and how brave he was being. He had read that unconscious patients could sometimes hear voices, and he wanted Sophie to know she wasn't alone either. Jake's physical injuries were healing, but the emotional trauma was overwhelming. He experienced nightmares, panic attacks, and periods where he would retreat so far into himself that he seemed unreachable. Marcus became his anchor, the one constant in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and frightening. Social workers had been assigned to find placement for the children, but it was complicated. They had no immediate family members who could take them in, and finding a foster family willing to accept 2 children, one with unknown long-term medical needs, was proving difficult. Marcus found himself becoming increasingly protective of both children, especially as he watched Jake struggle with each passing day. The breakthrough with Sophie came on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from a children's book about a dragon who was afraid of his own fire. When he noticed her eyelids flutter, he immediately called for the nurses, who confirmed that Sophie was beginning to regain consciousness. When Sophie finally opened her eyes, the first face she saw was Marcus's. She looked confused and frightened, trying to remember where she was and what had happened. Marcus spoke to her in the same gentle voice he had used with so many other children. "Hi, Sophie. My name is Marcus. You're in the hospital because you were hurt in a car accident. You've been sleeping for a long time, but now you're waking up, and that's wonderful. Your little brother Jake is here too, and he's been waiting for you to wake up." Sophie's memory came back gradually over the next few hours. When she finally asked about her parents, Marcus had to deliver the devastating news all over again. Watching this 8-year-old girl process the loss of her parents was one of the most difficult moments of Marcus's life. But he stayed with her, holding her hand and promising that she and Jake would face whatever came next together. The reunion between Sophie and Jake was both heartbreaking and beautiful. Jake had been so worried about his sister, and seeing her awake and talking brought the first genuine smile to his face since the accident. Sophie, despite her own grief and confusion, immediately took on the role of protective big sister, trying to comfort Jake even as she struggled with her own emotions. Dr. Chen began to realize that Marcus's role with these children was evolving beyond anything the therapeutic companion program had originally envisioned. He wasn't just helping them cope with medical procedures or trauma. He was becoming their emotional guardian, their source of stability in a world that had been completely shattered. The hospital's legal and ethical committees were concerned about the extent of Marcus's involvement with the children. Some worried that he was becoming too emotionally invested, and that this could compromise his professional judgment. Others questioned whether it was appropriate for someone without formal credentials to take on such a significant role in these children's lives. But Marcus couldn't bring himself to step back. These children needed him in a way that went beyond any professional protocol or institutional guideline. They had lost everything, and somehow his presence had become the foundation upon which they were rebuilding their sense of safety and trust in the world. The situation became even more complicated when both children began expressing that they didn't want to leave the hospital if it meant leaving Marcus behind. Jake in particular would become extremely agitated whenever social workers came to discuss placement options. Sophie, despite being older and more understanding of the situation, also showed signs of severe anxiety about being separated from the man who had become their protector and source of comfort. Marcus found himself in an impossible position. He loved these children and wanted to ensure they had the best possible future, but he also knew that they needed stability and a real family, not just a hospital volunteer. The solution that was beginning to form in his mind was as surprising to him as it would be to everyone else who knew him. The decision that would change Marcus Thompson's life forever came to him during a quiet moment in the hospital chapel. He had been sitting there for over an hour, watching Sophie and Jake sleep in their adjoining rooms through the glass wall. Both children had been making progress physically, but emotionally they remained fragile and deeply attached to him. Every time social workers mentioned moving them to a foster home, both children would become distressed and beg not to be separated from Marcus. Marcus had never considered himself father material. At 34 years old, he lived alone in a small apartment, worked construction, and spent his free time volunteering at the hospital. He had always assumed that his unusual size and the practical challenges it created would make it difficult to provide a normal family life for children. But watching Sophie help Jake with his physical therapy exercises, seeing how they looked to him for comfort and guidance, Marcus realized that sometimes life asks you to do things you never imagined possible. The conversation with Dr. Chen was one of the most important of Marcus's life. He found her in her office late one evening, reviewing patient files and research papers. When he knocked on her door and asked if they could talk, she immediately set everything aside. "I've been thinking about Sophie and Jake," Marcus began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I know the social workers are having trouble finding a placement for them together, especially with Sophie's ongoing medical needs. And I know they're both struggling with the idea of leaving the hospital because it means leaving me behind." Dr. Chen nodded, having observed the same concerns. "It's not uncommon for traumatized children to form strong attachments to their caregivers. In some ways, it's a healthy sign that they're able to trust and bond again after such a devastating loss. Marcus took a deep breath before continuing. I want to apply to become their foster parent, with the goal of eventual adoption. I know it sounds crazy. A single man with no parenting experience wanting to take on 2 traumatized children. But I love them, Dr. Chen. They feel like my family already. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Dr. Chen studied Marcus's face, seeing the sincerity and determination in his eyes. Finally, she spoke. Marcus, this is a huge decision that will change every aspect of your life. Are you prepared for the challenges? The sleepless nights, the emotional setbacks, the financial responsibility, the complete reorganization of your priorities and lifestyle? I've been thinking about all of that, Marcus replied. I know it won't be easy. My apartment is too small, so I'll need to find a house. I'll need to learn about child development, trauma counseling, and probably a dozen other things I've never thought about before. But Dr. Chen, these kids have already lost everything. They deserve a chance to have a real family again. And if I can provide that for them, then that's what I want to do. The process of becoming approved as a foster parent was more complex than Marcus had anticipated. He underwent extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, home studies, and interviews. Social workers questioned every aspect of his life, from his financial stability to his support system to his long-term plans for the children's care. One of the biggest concerns was Marcus's physical size and how it might affect the children's development and social integration. Some evaluators worried that other children might be afraid of Marcus, potentially isolating Sophie and Jake from normal childhood friendships. Others questioned whether his gentle nature was truly consistent or if there were aspects of his personality that hadn't been revealed during his hospital work. Marcus addressed these concerns with the same patient determination he brought to everything else in his life. He arranged for character references from dozens of people who had known him for years, co-workers, neighbors, hospital staff, and families of children he had helped. He took parenting classes, first aid certification, and even consulted with child psychologists about the best ways to help traumatized children adjust to new family structures. The most touching part of the evaluation process came when the social workers interviewed Sophie and Jake themselves. Both children were asked about their feelings regarding potentially living with Marcus permanently. Sophie, now 9 years old and remarkably articulate for her age, spoke with a maturity born from trauma and loss. Marcus makes me feel safe, she told the social worker. When I have nightmares about the accident, he sits with me until I fall asleep again. He doesn't get mad when Jake cries or when I have bad days. He reads to us and helps Jake with his exercises, and he always keeps his promises. I know my mommy and daddy can't come back, but Marcus feels like family now. Jake, still only 5 but wise beyond his years, was more direct in his assessment. I want to live with Marcus forever. He's big enough to protect us from anything scary, but he's not scary himself. He gives the best hugs in the whole world. The children's input carried significant weight in the final decision. Child welfare experts recognized that forcing them into a placement they didn't want could cause additional trauma and potentially undo the progress they had made in their emotional healing. While waiting for the final approval, Marcus began preparing for the possibility of becoming a single father. He found a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a large backyard where the children could play safely. The house needed significant modifications to accommodate his size: reinforced furniture, raised countertops in the kitchen, and doorways that were wide enough for him to move through comfortably. More importantly, he began creating spaces that would feel welcoming and secure for 2 children who had lost everything familiar in their lives. Sophie's room was painted in her favorite purple color, with built-in bookshelves and a window seat where she could read and watch the birds in the backyard. Jake's room featured a train theme, with a model railroad track that ran around the entire perimeter of the room. The transition from hospital to home was carefully planned and gradually implemented. First, Sophie and Jake began spending afternoons at Marcus's new house while still returning to the hospital to sleep. This allowed them to become familiar with their new environment, while maintaining the security of their familiar hospital routine. Dr. Chen remained closely involved in the transition process, monitoring both children's emotional and psychological adjustment. She was amazed by how quickly they adapted to living with Marcus. The nightmares became less frequent. Their appetites improved, and they began showing genuine excitement about simple things like helping Marcus cooked dinner or working together in the garden. Yay. Official adoption hearing was scheduled for 6 months after the children had moved in with Marcus permanently. During those months, Marcus learned that parenting was indeed the most challenging and rewarding experience of his life. There were difficult moments, times when Sophie struggled with grief over her parents, times when Jake regressed and needed extra comfort and support, and times when Marcus questioned whether he was truly equipped to give these children everything they needed. But there were also moments of pure joy that Marcus had never experienced before. Sophie's first genuine laugh since the accident came when Marcus accidentally got his head stuck in a doorway while trying to retrieve a toy from under her bed. Jake's proudest moment was when he successfully rode a bicycle for the first time, with Marcus running alongside him despite the comical sight of such a large man trying to keep pace with a small bike. The community that had followed Marcus's story through the local media rallied around the new family. His construction crew organized workdays to help finish renovations on the house. The hospital staff threw a housewarming party. Teachers at the children's school worked with Marcus to ensure Sophie and Jake had all the support they needed to succeed academically while continuing to process their trauma. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus discovered that his own sense of purpose and identity was deepening in ways he had never expected. Being responsible for Sophie and Jake's well-being gave new meaning to his work at the hospital, his relationships with friends and colleagues, and his plans for the future. He began thinking about things he had never considered before: college funds, family vacations, parent-teacher conferences, and all the ordinary experiences that make up a childhood. The adoption hearing itself was an emotional culmination of a year-long journey. Judge Patricia Morrison had reviewed the extensive case file and was clearly moved by the unusual circumstances that had brought this family together. When she asked Sophie and Jake if they wanted Marcus to become their legal father, both children answered with enthusiastic yes responses that brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Morrison said as she signed the final papers, "it's rare that we see such a clear example of a family that was meant to be together. You have shown extraordinary commitment to these children, and they have shown remarkable resilience and love in return. It is my honor to grant this adoption and to officially make you a family." The celebration that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Sophie and Jake presented him with handmade cards declaring him the best dad in the world, and Marcus found himself crying tears of joy for the first time in his adult life. The gentle giant who had spent years helping other people's children heal had finally found his own children to love and protect. 5 years after the adoption was finalized, Marcus Thompson stood in the backyard of their home, watching 14-year-old Sophie help 10-year-old Jake practice batting for his little league team. The sight still filled him with wonder. These two children who had once been broken and lost were now thriving, confident, and secure in their place in the world. Sophie had grown into a remarkable young woman with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination. Despite the trauma of her early childhood, or perhaps because of it, she had developed an extraordinary capacity for empathy and a desire to help others. She volunteered at the same children's hospital where Marcus continued his work, reading to younger patients and helping them feel less afraid during their treatments. Jake had inherited his adoptive father's gentle nature and protective instincts. Though still small for his age, he had become the defender of underdogs at school, standing up for children who were being bullied despite being barely big enough to make a physical difference. His teachers often commented on his unusual maturity and kindness toward others. The family's story had become something of a legend in their community and beyond. Medical journals continued to publish research based on Marcus's therapeutic methods, and the program at St. Mary's Hospital had been expanded and replicated at medical centers across the country. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing his insights about the healing power of genuine compassion and human connection. But for Marcus, the greatest success wasn't the professional recognition or the academic acclaim. It was the ordinary moments of family life. Helping Sophie with her algebra homework despite being terrible at math himself, cheering at Jake's soccer games, and having family movie nights where all three of them barely fit on their custom-made couch. The challenges of raising two children as a single father had been significant, especially given their traumatic backgrounds. Both Sophie and Jake had required ongoing counseling to help them process their grief and develop healthy coping mechanisms. There had been difficult periods when old wounds would resurface, triggered by anniversaries or unexpected reminders of their loss. Marcus had learned to navigate these challenges with patience and love, always seeking professional guidance when he felt out of his depth. Dr. Chen had remained a close family friend and advisor, helping Marcus understand when the children's behaviors were normal responses to trauma and when additional intervention might be needed. One of the most significant challenges had come during Sophie's early teenage years when she began asking difficult questions about her biological parents and the accident that had claimed their lives. She wanted to visit the crash site, see photographs of her parents' final days, and understand details that Marcus felt might be too painful for her to process. Working with family therapists, Marcus had learned to balance Sophie's need for information and closure with appropriate protection of her emotional well-being. They had created a memory book together, filled with photographs and stories from her parents' friends and relatives. They had visited the cemetery regularly, and Marcus had encouraged Sophie to maintain relationships with extended family members who had remained in contact. Jake's challenges had been different but equally complex. As he grew older, he began to struggle with survivor's guilt and questions about why he had lived when his parents had died. He sometimes acted out in school or became withdrawn at home, testing the stability of his relationship with Marcus and Sophie. During these difficult periods, Marcus had drawn on everything he had learned from his years of working with traumatized children. He provided consistent, unconditional love while maintaining clear boundaries and expectations. He sought help from professionals when needed and never pretended to have all the answers himself. The breakthrough moments had been as meaningful as the challenges. Sophie's first A+ in science class, earned on a project about childhood development and trauma recovery. Jake's decision to join the school's peer mediation program, where he helped other students resolve conflicts peacefully. Both children's growing confidence in their own abilities and their secure attachment to Marcus and each other. As the children grew older, they began to understand more fully the extraordinary nature of their family's origin story. They took pride in Marcus's work at the hospital and often accompanied him on special visits to meet other families facing difficult circumstances. Sophie had announced her intention to study medicine or psychology in college, inspired by her own experiences and Marcus's example of using personal gifts to help others heal. Jake had developed an interest in social work and family counseling, talking about wanting to help other children who had experienced loss and trauma. Both children had internalized Marcus's fundamental belief that difficult experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and compassion for others. The ripple effects of their story continued to spread in unexpected ways. Other families had been inspired to consider adopting older children or siblings who might otherwise be difficult to place. Medical professionals had incorporated Marcus's approaches into their own practices. Most importantly, hundreds of children had benefited from improved therapeutic programs that had been developed based on the success of Marcus's methods. But perhaps the most profound impact had been on Marcus himself. The man who had once seen his unusual size as something that set him apart from others had discovered that his differences, both physical and emotional, were actually his greatest gifts. His capacity for gentleness, combined with his imposing presence, had created a unique ability to provide comfort and security to those who needed it most. Marcus often reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point in his life. From the lonely, uncertain young man who had felt like an outsider because of his size, to the confident father and community leader he had become, he understood now that his unusual physical characteristics had never been obstacles to overcome. They had been tools that allowed him to serve others in ways that no one else could. On quiet evenings, when both children were doing homework and the house was peaceful, Marcus would sometimes sit in his oversized chair and marvel at the fullness of his life. He had found his purpose not in spite of being different, but because of it. His size, which had once made him feel isolated, had become the foundation for a career helping others. His gentle nature, which had sometimes been seen as incongruous with his imposing appearance, had enabled him to connect with traumatized children in ways that changed their lives forever. The gentle giant had discovered that the most important healing he had ever facilitated was his own transformation from someone who saw his differences as limitations into someone who understood them as gifts. In learning to use his unique qualities to help others, Marcus had found not only his calling, but his family, his community, and his complete sense of belonging in the world. Looking toward the future, Marcus knew there would be new challenges as Sophie and Jake continued to grow and eventually create lives of their own. But he also knew that the foundation of love, trust, and resilience they had built together would sustain them through whatever came next. The gentle giant had become not just a healer of others, but the creator of a family that would continue to spread compassion and healing for generations to come.